If you're considering this 18-volt Ozito multifunction tool, you're probably like me, where you're a bit of a hobbyist handy person as opposed to a professional. And so with this video, I'm not comparing this 1.2 kilogram tool to its competitors, but I'm more just explaining my key learnings from using this tool over the last few years from the point of view of a complete beginner. And so this video will be divided into 4 of the following sections. The first one being just the basic functions and controls. The second section being the cutting blades for plunge cuts or normal cuts. Third section being for paint scraping. And last but definitely not least, and this is probably the most useful function of this tool, being for sanding. And so, part 1, how do we actually use this tool? Well, first up, just like every other tool in the Ozito range, it clips in and out, and this battery can work with basically all the other tools that you can see here, including my lawnmower and whippersnipper. But as I'm demonstrating all the connections and attachment points around here, I'm going to have the battery disconnected, because the last thing I need while I'm putting my fingers around here is this thing to be accidentally activated, and you can imagine the amount of damage that's going to do to my hands. And so pretty much for the rest of the video, apart from when I'm demonstrating this in action, the battery will not be connected. And so first up, how do we actually put the attachments on? I mean, you can see 12 pins in here and you can see 12 holes in here. Is it just as simple as putting it on? Well, not quite, but it is actually still a very easy process. So all you have to do is just slide this around here like so, and then you'll find that the 12 pins will actually connect and actually slide into place. And then to secure it, you just put this back down, and then you find it's actually pretty sturdy on the connection. And so with that, I now want to talk about an incorrect assumption that I had about this tool that you probably have as well, being the first time user. And so when you're cutting along, you'll be assuming that it's moving in a side-to-side motion, but it's actually moving in an orbital or a rotation motion, although it's very small and hard to see with the naked eye. And when you think about it, this kind of makes sense, because with this tool, you can actually change the angle for which the blade is connected. So you could have it up straight like this, or you could have it on the side, like so. And so if it's were to be moving on a side-to-side motion, instead of the blade moving up and down like it would have been if it was straight, it's now going to be moving like this. And naturally, that's going to destroy any blade because these blades are not chopping axes. And so with being able to change the angle on this, does this mean that because we can change the angle that we should be doing it all the time? Well, in my humble opinion, no. Just because you can, it doesn't always mean that you should. And the biggest reason for this is, say if you're cutting along and you start to make a little bit of a mistake or you start to veer off course. When the tool is straight, it's pretty obvious from the angle of the overall tool if this were to start to happen, and you could probably correct it or stop it before it gets too out of hand. But say if you were to have this on a weird funky angle, unfortunately the first time that you probably notice the error in your cut will be when you actually see it in the cut itself, as opposed to seeing that the tool is on a weird angle because it started off on a weird angle. Alright, and now I've got to reattach the battery because I want to demonstrate another function of this tool. This little notch in the back here. With this little wheel on the back here, you'll notice that you have a minimum, and then it goes all the way from 1 to 5 until you reach a certain point where it says maximum. And so what is this? Well, it's just the oscillation speed. Just as a point of difference, here's a demonstration of it on minimum. Whereas now, if you could put it on maximum, it sounds like this. So you can actually hear the difference in that power between the two modes. And obviously you have all the numbers in between as well if you don't want to be on either extreme. So what speed should you use for what types of cuts or what types of settings? Well, if it is a hardwood, you want it on the maximum. Whereas if you're cutting a soft plastic, you'd have it on the minimum. And then meanwhile, for things like a low quality MDF wood, you could have it say on a 2 maybe. And so what are the downsides of going too slow and what are the downsides of going too fast with this? Well, if you go too slow, you get this, you risk falling into the vent which is known as a kickback. And it's not the cool type of kickback where you get a bribe for turning a blind eye. With this type of kickback, you'll be cutting along, and then the blades would actually get stuck on the bit of wood or material that you're cutting. And then as it gets stuck, instead of the blade moving on the wood, it'll be yourself and the tool moving. And naturally that could lead to a lot of wrist injuries, and it's pretty embarrassing as well when it happens. And so that's the danger of going too slow. And what about the downside of cutting too fast? Well, The downside is that you may lose control, where you'll be happily cutting along, then suddenly you come across a bit of soft material, and then you just slide right along, and you lose all direction and control, and it may result in a very messy looking end product. And so if you don't know what speed you should be at, where should you start? Well, start at the lower speed, but don't apply too much force. If you are going way too slow but not pushing too hard into it, you won't accidentally do a kickback. Kickbacks only happen when you're both applying a lot of force and the oscillation speed is too low. And how many oscillations is this doing per minute? Well, on its maximum setting, it is 12,000 oscillations per minute. And so that is all the basic controls of the tool covered. But before we actually go to using this thing, just remember the very obvious boring step to apply a lot of PPE. And so now let's talk about the first function of this multifunction tool, cutting blades. Where this multi-tool really comes into its own and where it can do a bit of a function that not many other tools can do is to do a plunge cut. And so what is a plunge cut? Well, with a plunge cut, instead of being like a normal cut where you can just cut on the side and work your way through, for whatever reason, you'll have to be starting in the middle. If you only need a tiny hole, obviously using a drill will be better. And if you're starting from the side, you're actually probably better off using either a jigsaw or a circular saw because it'll be a far neater cut and it'll require a lot less elbow grease. However, if budget really is a constraint and you don't really have much money and you can only afford one tool, well then yes, you still can cut from the side using this tool. It just won't be as neat a result as what a circular saw or a jigsaw would have provided for you. And so what is the technique for using this tool when you are doing a cut of some sorts? Well, the first thing that I must put a lot of emphasis on is to talk about stabilization, and I'll explain why this is so important. And so, using the example of a jigsaw, the weight of the tool and just the ease for which you can control it will keep the cut very neat. However, if you apply that exact same principle here, you basically be cutting along so, and just look at the amount of room there is for instability. And so, how do you actually achieve this stability? Well, there's a number of ways to do it. And so one such method is to actually hold the tool like so, and then put your other hand under the cut, and then sort of use that as a bit of a stable base to control it. Another such technique, which I'm personally not a fan of, but other people do this, is to actually rotate the tool around, and then as you're cutting along, the base of the tool could sort of be acting as your stabilizing force. However, the reason why I do not personally like this technique though, is that if it were to start veering off course and going off sideways, you probably wouldn't notice until it's too late. So right now, if you are planning to do a cut and you're worried about it being neat and you're not really sure what technique you're going to do and you're not really too confident that using a hand as a bit of a mount is going to be stable enough for you, well, there is actually another little hack that you can do. And so this sneaky little trick is, say after you've done your measurements and you've drawn on it, what you can actually do is use a Stanley knife and sort of cut an indent into the wood, and then this will sort of provide like a little guide track for your cutting blade as it's going through. And so now let's actually talk about these cutting blades themselves. How do you know what is the right blade for the right cut? Well, one very simple rule of thumb is that the larger and further apart the teeth are, the better it is for larger messy cuts. Whereas if the teeth are very small and close together, it'll be very good for precise cuts, but it'll obviously take a little bit more elbow grease to actually get it through the material that you're cutting. And so what if you forget this rule? Well, never fear, because the material that they're ideally used to be cutting through is actually written on the blades themselves. Now, another consideration for what blade to pick is if you're a bit nervous about inhaling dust particles. And obviously you'd be wearing the respiratory PPE no matter what. But if you want to add another layer of safety on top of the PPE, you can use a blade with larger cutting teeth. And so let's just say you've picked an appropriate blade for the appropriate material, you're happy with the amount of teeth that you have, and now you actually want to get cutting into the material. Outside of considering stability, what is the optimal way for both the protection of the blades and for the efficiency of the cut? So let's just say that I'm demonstrating this in the cut. If you're cutting like this, it's not really much of an area where the cut up bits of wood can go to, and so then it stays in the area where you're cutting and then provide you further resistance and also slow down your cut. Furthermore, it'll build up a bit of heat friction, and that'll and over time that'll dull your blade, and also it'll be very hard elbow work. However, if you're to be holding the blade and sort of cutting through like this, what that'll do is it gives all the dust and bits that you're cutting an outlet, and then moves it all out of the way, and so then you'll not be working against bits that are already cut, you'll only be working against bits that are yet to be cut, hence the most efficient way to do it. And so just to reiterate or say that again, Now don't hold it straight like this, don't hold it straight like that, hold it on a bit of an angle like so. And when you're cutting through, a big mistake that I personally used to make all the time was that I'd start off like this and then sort of get through, and then I'd sort of try and work the way through the entire depth as I made my way through. However, a more efficient way is to actually just do a very shallow cut, make it all the way across, and then once you've done that, just go a little bit deeper again, and then maybe a third or fourth time, just deeper again, and then deeper again. And so this is effort-wise, and also for protection of your blades-wise, the most efficient angle in order to cut through any material that you're trying to get through. And so that moves us on to the next part of this video, and that is the paint scraper. And so with this paint scraper, this is part 3. This is pretty much the quickest part of the video. And let's just say that you're trying to get a bit of paint off this wood. It's you don't want to be going in too deep like this, because obviously it's going to create little chisel marks along it. You don't want to be going too shallow because it's doing nothing. So you just want a bit of a nice shallow angle here where you're sort of getting under the existing paint and sort of bubbling it off and pushing it off. And so that's honestly it. I wanted to talk more about this function because I feel like this function is getting less airtime than the other functions of the tool, but you can also use former cutting blades if you've lost your paint scraping attachment, or for whatever reason you've damaged it in some weird way. And so now I'll move on to probably the most useful part of this tool, in my humble opinion, and that is the sanding function. For the sanding function, there's a bit of an extra step you have to do in order to get this to sand. So naturally, yes, you do still have that connection. You can put it on. But unlike the other blades where you're ready to go, there is one additional step, and that is to put Velcro onto this connection. And now you're ready to sand. And so in the original package, you'll be provided with 60, 80, and 1200 grit sandpaper. In this particular case, this is 60. And so what do the different grit numbers mean? Well, if you have something that is very rough, you want a low grit number, because that'll sort of get at all the very rough, larger parts and eventually get it down to a level which is sort of acceptable. However, if you're working on, say, something like restoring a vehicle's car headlight, and by the way, I don't think anyone should be DIYing that, that should only be a professional task, but say hypothetically you were doing that task, well, in that case, you would be using a 1200 grit sandpaper, or potentially even something higher, to restore the car headlight. And so for me personally, for projects around the house, I've never needed to go above 150 grit sandpaper. And so with this sandpaper connection, it is 93 by 93 by 93 millimeters, or 9.3 centimeters on each side. A good thing about these little corners too is that you could be so happily sanding away, but then let's just pretend that this is connected to a wall that you don't want to do any damage to. You can sort of hold the tool like this. You can get very close to the wall and not do any damage to the other part of the wall that you don't want to damage, or you don't want to accidentally sand. Now furthermore to that, another trick that you can do with this as well is that you can get a little bit of some kind of protective material. It can even be something as flimsy as a piece of cardboard, and then kind of just hold it there so then you're not accidentally bumping that side wall as well. And naturally with this, you should only be using the tips for when you're doing the delicate, awkward corner areas, because if you're to do this all the time, well, naturally you'll find that your three corners will wear away pretty quickly, whereas the middle will still be as good as new. So when you have a big round open area and you don't need to be too precise, try and have the tool like dead flat and sort of using the grit in the middle, and then use the edges for when you're doing the edges. That's a good way to think of it, actually. And so that's pretty much the majority of the functionality of this tool. And there are a couple of attachment accessories that I haven't really spoken about today, and these fall into two categories. One being that is kind of pretty obscure and not really realistically used that much by a hobbyist handy person, and the other one being the multi-brand adapter. So if you're putting on accessories from another brand, have a bit of a quick Google or ask your hardware store attendant whether this can fit the attachment that you want to put into it from another brand. Chances are that it will. And so with that, that's pretty much everything about this multi-function tool. If you have any comments, thoughts, or experiences about this, please feel free to leave it on the video. And please stay tuned next week, where I'll be talking about the 511 bags and how useful they are for everyday life, and whether it's going to be an appropriate choice for you in your life.